Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Reading Roundtable where we bring on some bookish friends to talk about some stuff. This is another themed Reading Roundtable. If you didn't know, last time we did like a horror slash spooky read one for October, and this time we're doing one which has been a topic that we have discussed a lot in brief by doing some stuff on the channel, which is to read some adult books by traditionally YA authors, specifically to look at it as like a what's going on with this, because we've noticed a lot of migration of the authors that we know as sort of like core staple YA authors recently publishing adult books. So we all read some and are going to be talking about that. And then I think at the end of it, we're going to be doing a little bit of a discussion about that thing, like what we think this is doing, like where this might be coming from, based on the books that we've read. But first, let's introduce ourselves. I'll go first because I've been talking. Hi, I'm Michaela. One of the founding members of the channel. I've been around. If you didn't know, hi, I'm a bookseller. I work for Barnes & Noble, but I also read a bunch. Traditionally in these, I'm talking about fan fiction because most of my reading in the last year has been fan fiction based. But specifically for this video, I read an actual book. I read a real live, real traditionally published book. Normally my reading tastes tend to be horror, sci-fi, fantasy. I do read a good amount of literary fiction. Anything queer, I will read. It doesn't matter what the genre is. I did at one point read a good amount of YA, but like have not really in the last couple of years, unless like specific titles have poked up and been interesting to me. Usually that's something that Gretchen and I read together. We've read a handful over the years of like some YA books that we thought might be interesting to read, but like on my own, yes. On my own, I don't tend to go to the YA department very often, unless something really catches my eye at this point. So yeah, that's where I am at.
And I am the literary guest of the evening. my my name's Anne. Gretchen and I used to work together in a library, and I have since retired from library work, but have, I think, as Michaela sort of said, my reading preferences are sort of um, literary fiction. I enjoy reading. Romances, Gretchen and I have checked out. I will try reading anything, was the one thing that I learned working in a library. It's like, absolutely, I need to read whatever it is because it comes across my path. Um, and in regards to YA, I started reading YA when my kids were in the YA area, despite the criticism from my daughter that why would I want to read books written by adults about being kids, which is a whole nother topic, and valid and invalid at the same time, as most statements like that are. Um, but I used YA books just for interest to find out what is sort of going on in the universe of kids, or what do adults think is going on in the universes of kids. But in order to understand topics, topics that relate to things going on in my kids' lives, that relate to things going on socially, picking up a YA book, be it a memoir or be it a nonfiction or be it fiction, all of a sudden you get a view into something that you, as not being of the generation, really know nothing about. And YA books are awesome for that. I think adults should be forced to read YA books somewhere along the way, but that's my perspective.
I'm Gretchen, and I am traditionally on this channel now reading romance or history slash political science because those are the two sides of my brain. But back in the day, I was all YA all of the time, fanatically. This is my Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas t-shirt or sweatshirt that I have. If you don't know, I also have a tattoo from this book series on the shoulder. It says "Read all the stars." And I have a Throne of Glass bedspread upstairs, and I have Red Queen memorabilia from a signing I went to. I have books signed by Cassandra Clare and Holly Black and Sarah Reese Brennan. So like, this was a big, big thing for me for a really long time. And basically what happened was the pandemic, and my entire brain like snapped, and I don't know what it was, where either I was aging out of YA already, and just like romance, you know, with like more adult problems and concerns. And that's kind of where I have stayed. So I haven't really got back to it, even though there's plenty of unread YA books on my shelf. But I do have a degree in children's literature, a master's degree. And so for that, I like consumed so much YA in middle grade, and still try to keep up on it. So I'm very interested in this topic, and I'm so glad that we're talking about it, because it really does feel like so many. I mean, Sarah J. Maas is one of the many like started YA and have moved progressively up the chain. And as she said, because she wanted to write a sex book. And so, you know, sometimes that's just the reason. But we'll talk about maybe some of the other ones as well. But yes, and when we came up with doing this as a reading roundtable, both Michaela and I looked at each other and we were like, we need Anne. So glad that she is here to join us. And I can't wait to talk about all of her books.
We're gonna do this sorry, we're gonna do this slightly differently than our past reading roundtables. Normally it would be just each of us going around and talking about our book and like having a couple of questions or discussions based on that specific book. I think we're going to go around and talk about the books that we read recently that are pertaining to this topic still, but then I think at the end we're going to have a little bit more of a discussion type video where we talk about like this whole phenomenon in general, just from a bunch of different perspectives, because it's interesting to us. And as always, we would love for you to like join that conversation down in the comments as well, if you've noticed the trend or why you think that might be happening. But yes, so I will go first again. For this, the actual live book that I read was Yerba Buena by Nina LaCour. This is her first adult book. It came out last year. Before this, she had written 6 YA books. So it's her 7th book overall, but her first like adult one. Like her YA books, it is sapphic and queer. This is a story of 2 young women. It is technically a coming of age story. It starts with at least one of them at 16. I think it goes up till they're about 28, 29. So it is definitely that like 20s age bracket. And it very much is centering around the ideas of like who we are, what we're meant to be doing with our lives, and whether or not our past sort of defines us or it's something that we can escape from. It is pure literary fiction. I picked up this one in part because I wanted to pick up one that I thought would be a little bit different. Like we could go the romantasy route because all of these romantasy authors seem to be doing Gertrude's like, hello. Like there's a lot of them that are doing this now, and I like purposefully sought out an author who I thought would be doing something that like felt actually adult. I have not read any of Nina LaCour's YA stuff, but Gretchen has. And I had heard of a bunch of them, especially because one of them, I believe, won the Prince Award. So
yeah,
Gretchen verified for me that even her YA stuff is very well written and covers a lot of like kind of hard topics for kids. So it was one that I sort of had confidence that this was going to be a good book on its own and could stand up to adult and wouldn't feel like YA with a little plus bracket. So that I could bring in some part of that conversation to our conversation, because we had a feeling that some of this would still feel like YA, but with sex scenes or with a little bit more violence or something. This one definitely, like if you had handed this to me and had me read it and you after the fact told me that this was a YA author, I would have been like, I wouldn't have been able to tell. Like there's no way that I could have read this book and been able to tell, oh yes, this is someone who started in YA. I ordered in more copies of this to my store. I ended up giving it, I think like 4.5 stars on Storygraph. I ordered in more copies for my store and put a little shelf talker under it. This is one of those books where I feel like I would hand to anybody who, especially in their 20s, feels like they're like like that scene from The Emperor's New Groove where they're tied to the log, like going towards the waterfall with sharp rocks at the bottom, and you can't do anything about it. So you're just kind of watching this like tragedy about to happen. That's sort of how I felt like this book was like a camaraderie in that we have one character who has been restarting their undergraduate college experience over and over. She keeps changing her major, and it's been almost a decade and she's still working towards that bachelor's degree because she can't make up her mind. And part of that is from a fear of the future and a fear of commitment and a need to just like I can handle this. Like I know I can handle what I'm doing right now. I don't know if I can handle moving on from here yet. And then there is a second character who you get both of their point of views. It goes back and forth between the two of them, who at 16 ends up running away from home because her girlfriend at the time gets murdered, and it's kind of heavily implied that it was either her father or associates of her father who did the murdering. He's very clearly coded as somebody who's in organized crime in some way, probably drug distribution. And her girlfriend at the time may have run up a bill or something and wound up getting murdered. And when she makes this realization that her girlfriend got murdered by her father or somebody who she's grown up with, she's like, I can't be here anymore, and she runs away. There are some very dark themes in that section of the book in particular, because she goes into sex work to make the money that she needs to get to where she's going. And you come to this point where eventually these two characters' paths cross at a restaurant named Yerba Buena. And they sort of like float in and out of each other's lives a little bit before they come together as a romantic couple. I loved this. It was great. Highly recommend it. Especially, like I said, to people who have that feeling that like life kind of ran away with them and they've just been swept along. That's sort of how this felt. So yeah, highly recommend this one. It was really good.
And I read who I thought was adult romance author, who Gretchen's reviewed, I want to say probably a number of times, but certainly the last beach reads, I had to read it and then I had to go run out and get it because I'm like, oh, Gretchen's got another one she really likes and I've got to go find it. But Emily Henry, I can't confirm, but I think she started out as a YA author because she has books. A number of them. I've read, I think, 3 of them now in preparation for this, but we'll just focus on one. And so for me, not being the YA specialist that you guys are, I was just sort of trying to process what's different between this particular author and a YA book that they've written. And of course, I've read a few of them now, and I think I've read all of the romances because Gretchen's always saying, you really need to read this one. I'm like, okay.
Oh, good.
But the 2 books that I sort of grabbed for tonight was, the first one's Emily Henry's most recent adult romance novel called Happy Place, which if you want to have a decent review, a brilliant review, just go find Gretchen's and you'll find all the details about it there. But it's basically about 2 friends, they're a couple which have now sort of split up, but none of their friend group knows about this. And for a week, because one of the friends has decided to get married based on the closeness that it's brilliantly convoluted. But these guys try to pretend they're still together. And of course, spoiler alert, in the end, they fall back in love and realize they really never wanted to split up in the first place. But it's a sort of a brilliantly done, what I would think as an adult reading an adult romance novel. It was just had wonderful complexities in the relationship. The whole friend group was fascinating. It was just a real delight to read. And there are a lot of sort of contemporary, romance novels by adult authors, and Emily Henry included, that are sort of set in the modern world that aren't your bodice rippers. They're talking about, issues between an interesting couple, be it transgender, whatever the sexuality, but there's more there than just getting undressed and winding up in bed, and and not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm not dissing that at all. I'm just saying these books are sort of interesting. They're the complexity of relationships leans a little bit into literary fiction, even though it's not literary fiction, but there are issues going on that are worth exploring. The book that that I'm sort of highlighting of Emily Henry's sort of YA books, it was called 1 Million Junes, and it is a book about two clans. So it's sort of set in the fantasy world, kind of, but it's also one of the characters, the two primary characters are Jack, who's actually June. She was the first child born, and every child in this family who's born, the first one is Jack. And they've always been males, except she's a female. And so she gets known as June, probably because of the month that she was born in. And the other, so Jack O'Donnell, and the youngest version, and the other character is Saul Angust. And they're from two different clans, two different kinds of people. This whole town is sort of rotates around how the different clans interact with each other, and they sort of keep a peace in this unusual town. This town has perfect weather, it's got perfect everything, and it's all, related to how these families interact. And some of that starts to unravel as these two, who are supposed to be sworn enemies and should never interact because one of the ancestors said so, they of course discover that they have feelings for each other, or are want to explore, or just like, I don't understand. But anyway, the story sort of continues that way. For me, the primary difference between the YA Emily Henry book and the adult Emily Henry book, the complexity of characters seems similar in both of the books, in terms of that she's really character focused, I would say. I think that's one of the primary things. And it's about getting people together and exploring what's going on. And in the YA book, it happens in sort of a fantasy world. And the focus is, I think, we sort of have mentioned with Gretchen and Michaela, is that the focus in A Million Junes is that June lost her father somewhere along the way. And it's all, as I said, in this fantasy world. But the focus is in some ways on death and grief and life and changing relationships. I liked them both. I really need to do more research on Emily Henry. I want to find out whether it's actually true. There's a similarity between her books, but whether she is actually started out as a YA author, and at the moment, I love them both. If I had to guess, I'd say she might be sort of, yeah, we'll talk about it later. Why would be doing what she's doing, because I could go on for a while. But anyway, that's sort of a quick summary. That's a very brief, Gretchen could give you guys a brilliant articulate summary about the two books, but it was really interesting to read a YA book and an adult book by the same author. It was just really interesting.
Yeah, and I feel like I learned something new, because I didn't know Emily Henry had written young adult books. And then also the question becomes too, is no matter the publication order, which ones did she write first? And then which ones was she able to get public? Like that's always a question as well. So just very interesting. I wonder if she talks about it in an interview somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's why I love her book so much, is that extra complexity. Authors like her and Denise Williams, who say, yes, there's a romance, but also life is messy. Don't get me wrong, I love me a good, just quick and dirty romance as well. But there are just some books that go above and beyond. So as we transition into more of a discussion phase, I want to very briefly talk about two romance novels by authors who were previously YA that I've already reviewed on this channel. So I will give you the briefest, barest bones of what these books are about. But if you want like the individual reviews of those books, we'll have them linked either above or, below in the video, depending on how many cards we have by this point to use. And you can go and watch those. And so I want to talk about the X-Hex. And technically, if you look at the cover of the X-Hex, it will tell you that the author is Aaron Sterling. But this Aaron Sterling is a pen name for Rachel Hawkins, who I owned every single YA book in a specific series that she put out. And it was one of the few, I don't reread books that often, but her Hex Hall series were books that I reread. Like they always made me happy. I called them popcorn books because they were easy to read, but they were exciting and I loved them. And essentially it was supernatural boarding school. She thinks she's part witch, but her powers come from somewhere different. And it gets into like magical politics and the dark arts and feuding like anti-magic versus pro-magic factions. It's a whole thing. And of course she falls in love with a boy who is on the other side. So I love them. They're really great. And then I also want to talk about The Blonde Identity by Ally Carter. Ally Carter, I think, is most famous for her Gallagher Girl books, which I think there was something like 15 of them, or like a maybe even more of them, which was spy girl boarding school. Big boarding school phase in YA at this time. And thank you, Harry Potter. And it was just kind of like they were like girls who were spies and they went on missions. They weren't very large. They were quite, they came out in like those thin paperback style situations for the most part. And I really liked a lesser known series of hers called Embassy Row, which was a girl who is the daughter of a diplomat who lives on Embassy Row in DC. And Embassy Row is, it's a real thing where, because like all of the embassies in DC are kind of on like one or two streets. And there's like some international espionage going on. And she like overhears something she's not supposed to know. And there's a boy and it's a whole thing. So these kind of themes, witches and spies, are also in these upgraded books. Now, I do want to make a mention that the reason Rachel Hawkins is writing under a pen name is because when she left YA originally, she started writing horror and thriller books, which she does under the Rachel Hawkins name. So when she came back to to romance-ish stories, she used a pen name to not confuse people. So I want to mention for her, she's been writing adult books for some time. This is not her immediate step over. But I've not read any of those because thrillers are not my thing. I don't know that Ally Carter has written anything in between. If she has, I'm not aware of it. I love X-Hex. X-Hex is the best glow up from the Hex Hall series. Like if you loved the Hex Hall books, but you wanted that, but like adult, this is great. It's also, I love me and enemies to lovers / second chance as well. And so the thing in that is that there is a girl who is a witch who has kind of turned her back a little bit on like the witch community. She is teaching like adult or like mundane students. And she really is trying not to like deal with that. And her ex crush / school nemesis is like one of the scions of like the witch families, right? And so he's like really big into that. And he ends up coming back to her hometown, and she does what she thinks is a little pretend curse because she does not have much magic. She's not known to be strong in magic like at all. So they like do this like joke curse on him, which turns out to be a real curse, which turns out to poison the ley lines in the town. And it like at one point there are like animated skeleton tchotchkes that are like attacking them. It's like a whole thing. I love that book, and I loved the sequel as well. And there's a third book coming, and I've reviewed both of those books, and I'll review the third book when it comes out. But they're lovely, and they absolutely gave me the vibes of hex haul with a more like complicated story, adult, like politics and themes and like, who are we as people type of things, which are also very YA. But I loved it. I was just like, this is exactly what I wanted. I wanted adult hex haul, and I got it.
Yeah.
I got what I came for. So then I read The Blonde Identity. So this is a book in which the main character wakes up on a street in Paris and she has no idea who she is. She has hit her head and she has amnesia. What she does know is there are very angry Russians with guns on motorcycles chasing her. And she's like, oh my God, I'm a spy. And out of the darkness comes like a man, like a very hot, sexy man who also has a gun. And he says, let me protect you. And she's like, oh my God, I'm a spy and I know James Bond. And so with her options being the scary white Russian or scary Russians on motorcycles that clearly want to kill her, or the hot guy offering to protect her, she goes, I'm going with hot guy. As I think many of us would in this situation. Come to find out, she is not a spy. She is the identical twin sister of a spy. She is a romance novelist, and unfortunately for her, her sister has run afoul of both the United States and Russian and British and NATO UN powers because she stole something. And the Russians and the Americans and the UN powers all think she is her sister because no one can find her actual sister. And there is a very odd plot that follows, which is funny in some parts, but here's the thing. It is absolutely still holding on to that YA habit of everything that comes out of her mouth has to be the sassiest thing you've ever heard. And that is like a YA trope of like, here's how I prove to you I am the specialist girl in the room, is that I am just funny and sassy and I always have a quip. I'm quippy. And I feel like that kind of humor like works in a moment. But if that is the only way the character talks it stops being funny. It's not funny anymore. Yeah. And also there were some reveals about the character in the end where I was like, what? You just made a bunch of things not make sense. But it was absolutely that thing where like when I was reading YA as a kid, I feel like I really loved that. I thought that was hilarious. I would like take my best lines and like use them in my own conversations, right? Because I thought they were so funny. And as an adult, I'm just like,
no one talks like this.
I'm just really annoyed. So there have been people who really enjoyed this book. And I'm not saying it was like a terrible book and I wouldn't tell you to read it, but I just felt like quip fatigue by the time I got to the end of it. And so I feel like both of these books are really doing like the exact same thing they did as YA books, just like blown up into adult books. And one of them has hit a better like adult tone, and the other one is trying to apply, I think, maybe too much YA in a way where I'm like, please make it stop. I don't think this is this funny anymore. So I'm glad that I read, and I mean, it's not the only book. I've also read like Taylor K. Mejia's Sammy Espinoza's Last Review, which is also, I really liked that one, but I've never read any of their YA. So I've read more good than bad, but I think those are two really good examples of taking what you did in a YA book, bringing it up, and having two very different results.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, now that you sort of have an idea of some of the stuff that we've read recently for this discussion, we kind of wanted to talk about these like questions that we've had about this in general, which was, are these just YA plus? Like, is it a YA book with YA structure and YA tropes, but with sex scenes? Or is it actually an adult book, which you just happened to be a YA author before this. That was like the first main question. And I could say for mine, definitely like this is an adult book. Again, like I said, if you could pick this up off the shelf in the adult section, you would read it entirely and you would never know that this author wrote YA unless you looked into it. Like it is literary fiction. Like it's not trying to be literary fiction, it is literary fiction. And I know that like some of the criticisms that we've seen of like some of the more popular YA, specifically romantasy authors that have done this, have sort of been, it's just YA with sex scenes. So like I don't think any of us have grabbed one of those big ones. Like none of us did Leigh Bardugo or Holly Black or like anything like that. So like keep in mind that this is only a snippet within this whole movement that is happening. There is a chance that we missed some stuff that definitely is YA plus. But I can speak at least for Nina LaCour that like that one's an adult book. Like it 100% is just an adult book. Definitely not YA plus. Do you, Gretchen, you felt like the Ally Carter was YA plus, but do you feel
Yes.
like the Erin Sterling was not? That one is an
No.
adult romance, and if you didn't know, you wouldn't have known.
No, I mean, it's just very like, there's a lot of witchy romance. And
Yeah.
there was one called The Witch is Back that I reviewed like a month or so ago. And like, if you told me that that author previously wrote YA, I would believe you because I was
Okay.
like, how are these characters in their 30s and still acting like this? I don't believe you. When the entire point is it's a second chance romance and they spent 10 years apart, now they're coming, or 7 years or whatever, and now they're coming back like as adults. And I was like, no, you've never progressed past 17. Like
Yeah.
this felt like good witchy adult romance.
Right. Right. And I'd have to say for Emily Henry's, there is a difference, but the similarities. I don't think I'd give her. I mean, you could give Happy Place to anyone, but I just don't think a younger audience, a YA audience, would be particularly interested in reading it. But her other YA books, I could hand to an adult easily, and I think you'd enjoy it. Just she's a really good world builder in her the YA books that I read, and they are different. They're more on the fantasy end than her romance books. I love her across the board, truly, which is really kind of cool.
It's good. Yeah. It's always great when you find an author that like you could read literally anything by them, even if it
Yep.
was outside of your comfort zone and be like,
Yeah.
yeah, this is fine. I'm still enjoying this. Still having a good time.
Right.
That speaks to a good author, essentially. My next sort of question slash posit for this was like, is this in response to TikTok? Because nothing has sold books in the same way that TikTok does. I think there was recently just an article that came out that talked about all of the books that sold the most this year, and like 6 of them were Colleen Hoover, because specifically of how TikTok picked up Colleen Hoover's books and then that went across the country. And like the same thing could be said for like just the reading of Sarah J. Maas has exploded past the point that she was popular to begin with and then got like ridiculously popular.
Well,
Or
and then this whole thing with Iron Flame,
yes,
like that whole
yeah.
series.
Fourth Wing, yep.
Fourth Wing, that's the one.
Yep. Same thing. That one like exploded. And what a lot of people can sort of note about all of these authors and titles is that they do very clearly fit into this phantom new adult genre. They're people in their 20s. A lot of them are very romance heavy, very sex scene heavy, not necessarily, but pretty much. A lot of them are romantasy or straight, like not straight isn't not a queer, but like romance on its own. Like those are the 2 biggest genres that have had huge explosions. There was like the very first year that TikTok started doing this, there were a couple of YA books that hit that list. I'm thinking like They Both Die at the End was one of them. I'm trying to think of, I know there was other ones, but like it seems like as we move forward, TikTok books
Well, they
are
also like brought back Song of Achilles.
yes, yeah. Yep. Oh God, my brain is there was a series, there was a YA fantasy series that got my brain is saying The Air is one of the titles. Like do you know what I'm talking about?
No.
There was a this is gonna bother me. Hold on, let me
Can
pull it
I
up.
can I while you're looking this up, can I just talk to
Yes.
that for a second? I think
Yeah.
that it's really I think the answer to your question is almost yes and no,
Yeah.
because here's the thing. I think predominantly romance books are taking place when people are in their 20s. I don't think that that is new. It's like it's a thing in historical romance because they even when they're like 25, like right there a spinster in like,
Spinsters.
ye olde
So old.
England, right? And so I feel like it is very rare for me. I think it's more common to see people who are in their 30s now. And both of them. I'm not including age gap romances here because that's a whole other thing. But I think like I just finished one and they were both in their late or early 30s. But I feel like romance as a whole really likes the like late 20s range for because it's like they've had some experience, but they're except for I found some really excellent ones. Like I reviewed a little while ago, Do I Know You, which was two people who were actually married and had been married for some time. But a lot of times, even when I read the ones where they're married, it's because I got married too young and now they're doing it. So I think I think what's newer is this focus on romanticy.
Yes.
Because I feel like there was a really long time where like fantasy romance was relegated to the like grocery store paperback size along with like historical fiction, and then like you would see contemporary romance like in the big paperback on the shelf. And I feel like now like I just in our Barnes and Noble not too long ago, and it felt like previously when you walk through that section it was all like contemporary romance, and now you walk through and there's way more fantasy like on the regular shelf.
Yes.
So I think that's new.
I do also the one that I was thinking of is the Selection series by Kira Cass, which is also an older series that got like revitalized.
That was we read that.
Yes, I know. That's what I'm saying. It's like there's old YA series that TikTok is like, you missed out on this little undiscovered series. And I'm like, it was popular when we were reading it. It's just been 10 years since it's come out. Like it's not underrepresented. But yeah, like that's been happening. But I feel like even in the last year or so, the movement for that has been moving more towards adult stuff. The fact that the Goodreads Choice Awards this year had a romantasy category, which it didn't have, and if
had
you go
a romantasy category, but removed middle grade, children's, poetry.
Yeah. And Gretchen and I talked about it when we saw those things. Like if you look through the shortlisted titles for romance, romantasy, and fantasy, all three of those categories were skewed so hard with titles that were TikTok titles that the people who like traditionally have been reading those genres, like fantasy has traditionally been a very male heavy readership. Their books were not represented in those categories, and the romance section has traditionally been historical rom-com, and it was very much like Colleen Hoover. Like it was very skewed, very young readership, I feel like, and like the middle-aged moms who've been reading romance forever didn't have their books represented in there either, or at least not as much as it normally would be. So it's like definitely a thing has been skewing some stuff that is interesting to look at. I have a feeling it's going to affect publishing at this point too, which could be that all of our bookstores start creating a new adult area. Or it could be that like your traditional fantasy authors, your traditional romance authors are kind of pushed to follow these trends, because both of those categories are trope heavy like genres. Like they're genres that like function very much off of like each other and feeding off of the environment that's within those genres, as opposed to like a literary fiction or something else that is much more like personal book based. It's not trope heavy necessarily. Yeah, it's an interesting thing that I think we will be seeing repercussions of going forward, because of this. Like, it's definitely a thing. Um,
And I feel like you have like a thought. I feel it.
yes.
I'm just wondering if this is being discussed, or like how many people are aware of the influence of, I certainly with my generation and definitely with my aunt's generation, the 95-year-old people who still read, um, they, they don't do TikTok. They don't
No.
do, whatever sources you used from a certain era, you're just unaware of the influence. And I just think it's fascinating that there's, what's influencing what again. So I just have no idea of, I absolutely cool.
Well, I have a thought and a case study, and I want to ask you about this because I think you read this book. So first of all, I think I just saw Jess Owens, who has a fabulous booktube channel, did a video, and I haven't watched it, but was talking about the consequences of this basically turning book publishing into fast fashion.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, so that's a video that I know that she's done, and again, I haven't watched it, but since Jess did it, it will be amazing. And I can link that somewhere when we post this. But then also just like a case study too of like it's not always in one direction, because Anne, I think you read Talia Hibbert's YA book that just came out not too long ago, and Talia Hibbert for sure has been publishing romance for longer than I think people know. She's very famous, or hit the screens for a series about a series of women revolving around like a tech startup that I forget, but I have talked about on the channel. But then I actually went backwards and I read some of her older stuff, so I know that she's been publishing an adult romance for quite a while. But what was that YA book like? Because that's someone who went back the other way.
I'm gonna have to go back and go back. I need to go look at my notes, Gretchen.
I know I put you on the spot. I'm sorry, but I was just thinking, like,
No,
we're talking about it as something that's moving in one direction, and it's
direction.
certainly
Way. Yeah.
yeah. But that's someone who's gone that way.
Yeah, back to doing YA. I'll have to think more and do some research, because I just right now my brain's like, I haven't thought about that in
I mean, you can always feel free to go back and watch our first reading roundtable, because that's where you discussed that book. So
Right.
like,
Oh, okay, that's where it's coming from. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Okay, I was like, did I discuss this with Anne? Did she bring it up? So that's right. You've already discussed it in a recorded fashion. You can go back and look at that.
yeah.
Sad brain happens.
The end of the semester, nothing up here works anymore.
Yeah.
Burnt out.
That joke could be extended in so many ways.
This is fine. The last thing that I had sort of talked about as like maybe why this trend was happening was authors aging up with their readers, because like I said, and I think like Gretchen said, is that we've sort of aged out of reading at least primarily YA. I know for a long time that I really struggle reading at least straight YA fiction, like plain YA fiction, because I cannot care about high school drama. Like this doesn't matter in any scheme at all. Because you're going to go to college and learn a bunch of stuff, and then you're going to be an adult and learn a bunch of stuff, and none of this is going to be important to you at all. I know it's very important for those kids to read those books. I like totally understand the value in those stories, but as an adult, I don't care, and so I can't be bothered. Usually if you see me reading YA, it's YA fantasy, which still can sometimes have some problems. I can get a little bit uncomfortable reading a romance between children. it makes me feel a little skeezy
But
sometimes.
Michaela, the world is ending. And what will she do to pick between light-haired boy and dark-haired boy? They are so different. And the world is about to end, but this is a very, very
They need to
specific
make
problem.
out about it. Yeah, no. So like I did still like some of the tropes can get annoying and repetitive, and like there's like some of those things. But if we think about these authors that we've grown up with, like they may want to publish adult because of that, because we've aged out of being able to like enjoy reading some of those books. I feel like I could read something by Nina LaCour in YA and still feel like I'm getting something out of it, because it's still that like hard-hitting contemporary, like hard issues type of YA. Like I still really love A.S. King even now. Like I still, when A.S. King puts out a new book, I will pick it up and read it. Because like they're just important. Like for anybody to read, like Anne said, like there are just some YA books that you can hand to an adult, and just because the characters are teens doesn't mean that it's any less of value to like look at those concepts.
I think,
but
can I just,
yeah,
can I break in there for a hot minute
go
though?
for it.
Just
Go
because like
for
what
it.
you're saying, and I was just thinking, since we've been reading YA, it's also like YA has gotten, I don't want to say more issues based, because there's still just some fun stuff in there. But on the one hand, I was like, well, isn't it great now that YA is a little bit more grown up in the themes that it can tackle, and it's no longer a thing. Like I remember when Walter Dean Myers, put out Monster, or I remember the
Yes.
controversy around that, which was someone, and people were like, you can't do that in books for children, like you can't do that. And I
Yeah.
think obviously we're still having issues in what can and can't be in books for children, but in general, the change has been that you can talk about like Black Lives Matter, trans, LGBTQ, like whatever it is, like you can, like, depression. We can bring these things in because they're being dealt with, but at the same time, YA is having a problem where there's a huge gap for middle readers, where if you don't want the things in the children's section, but adult, like the YA stuff is now primarily about 18 and 19-year-olds.
Yeah.
Like there is no place for you in the middle, and I think that that's a huge problem.
That
So
could
I didn't want to
also
say like, isn't it great that YA is so grown up now, but like, there's still an issue with that as well.
that could also be why some of these authors are writing adult books now, is that they're like, hey, we're skewing YA too old, and we're leaving out the 12 to 14-year-olds who need books. They're too old for the young reader section, but they're not quite ready for all of these like hard romance sexy books. Like
Right.
making these adult books, which are the same sort of thing, it kind of moves them out of YA to maybe reset and level set YA back for the people it's supposed to be for, which is the young kids, because it is read a lot by new adults. It's read a lot by young 20 somethings, as well as like 12, 13, 14-year-olds. And those two readerships are looking for different things.
Right.
And should be given different things because they're at different places developmentally. There's
Right.
definitely YA books that you've seen Gretchen and I review where we're like, I wouldn't hand this, like if I wouldn't hand this to a 14-year-old. Like I don't think a 14-year-old is ready for this book. 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old, yeah, definitely take these, but like that like tween, early teen person, like where do you send them? Because it used to be we could just send them to YA and they could pick anything off the shelf. It didn't matter. It was developmentally appropriate for them. And I don't think that that's necessarily true in the YA genre as it was like 5, 6, 7 years ago.
Yeah, I would love to have you guys read a million in Junes just to see what you think. I think you could. I mean, I would be comfortable enough.
Mm.
I don't know for a 12-year-old, but a 14-year-old, I would hand this book, but I would also hand it to a 60-year-old. I really, maybe it's just my ultimate conclusion tonight is that Emily Henry is just a phenomenal author. I will read anything she does.
Good. Yes, that's what we always want, is to be able to hand it to anybody and have it have value and be worthwhile.
But I don't know that, again, I don't think that younger audience would be all that thrilled with, you know, the 25, 30 some odd year olds of the happy place. I
No.
just, they care. I don't think they're, yeah, so yeah.
Well, and I think that's like kind of the reason why I love second chance romances, because the entire point is that they were together when they were young, and the entire point of the book is kind of explaining how they've grown up.
Yeah.
And this is not related to this at all, but I'm a huge Taylor Swift fan. And I went to see the movie in theaters because I could not get a ticket, because it's the Hunger Games. And there were these two younger, like tween girls passing out friendship bracelets. And John and I were in the theater very early, so we were there when they were doing it. And they were like, "Do you want a friendship bracelet?" And I was like, "Oh my God, yes, I've never been able to get one because I've never been able to go to a concert." And so we were having a little bit of a chat, and they asked me what song I wanted. And I said, "Well, do you have a You're on Your Own kid?" And their immediate reaction was, "We couldn't possibly make a friendship bracelet out of that song. It's so sad." And I just went, that song is about, like, you know, you had bad things happen to you and you've grown up now and you've realized that you're strong. And it's
Yeah.
just like such that moment of like
Right.
you're right. If I was your age, I'd probably also read that song as really, really sad. But like just because of like what's happened in my life, like I appreciate that differently.
Yeah.
Um, and I feel like it's relevant to our discussion because there has to be stories for both of us, right?
Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
people who are
Yeah.
like need the thing for where they are, and then, you know, for us where we are. And one of my major concerns is that with the TikTok thing specifically is that blurs a little bit.
Yeah.
And like, you know, if you have tweens reading Colleen Hoover because it's what's popular, I'm not saying they're not. I know, and I'm not saying they're like they can't read those books, right? I'm not gatekeeping,
No.
but I'm just saying that those stories, you know, it's not where they are,
Yeah.
and may either make them feel bad about their lives or differently about their lives, or like because it's yeah.
Yeah.
That's a thing that happens to me a lot as a bookseller, especially right now at Christmas. A parent coming in and being like, "My teen wants this Colleen Hoover book because they're on TikTok." And I'm like, that is a dark romance with abusive elements that sort of are not super like touched on as that. And I don't want to give this to a 15-year-old. Like,
Yeah.
I personally am not comfortable having a 15-year-old read this because I don't feel like a 15-year-old is developmentally ready for the like breaking of like, is this a healthy relationship? Because they're going to read it and think that's so sexy. And
Right.
it's not. Like, as an adult, it's not.
Can
So
we
yeah, like
can
that's
can we
definitely a
just
thing.
stop with that? Those books after Beautiful Disaster, which got
Yeah.
made into a movie with one of the Sprouse twins. I've read all of those, and la, la, la. That
Yeah.
was just so uncomfortable. And I remember, like, you know, I had friends who read Twilight. You know, we all read Twilight when we were teens. It was a rite of passage. And like I literally had someone come up to me and she was like, "Isn't it so sexy how he watches her while she sleeps?" And I was like, "No, no,
Nope.
no,
That's
no."
creepy, actually.
But it was like the
That's
same,
really
like
weird
people
and
were like,
creepy.
but
Right.
it's like
Right.
they thought that was because that was being portrayed as, so they did it
Yes.
as, but also was like, you know, they were like, "Yeah, I'm really just finding pale guys to be really attractive." And I was like,
Great.
"Okay, do they sparkle? Do they?" And it's like it's easy to laugh at now, but there are things like, and I've talked about this before, like the R.L. Lefever's book Grave Mercy, which I gave 5 stars and loved as a teen, and then I read it again for my senior undergrad thesis, and I went, "This relationship is so toxic." Like there's a line where he says, "I am turned on by your fear." And as a teenager, I thought that relationship was so good. And so it's just like, I'm not saying there isn't YA that's already problematic, but I'm just saying that like when you turn into
Yeah.
some of these romance tropes or these romance books that are like really skating that edge, it just
Right.
I can bring fan fiction into this because it seems like every month, the fandoms that I'm in, I follow on Twitter and Tumblr and stuff, there's this discussion on whether or not it's moral to read specific things in fan fiction. So in fan fiction, there's this very well-known tag called Dead Dove Do Not Eat, which is a reference to a TV show where a character opens like an office fridge and there's a paper bag that's written on it says dead dove do not eat, and the character opens it up and looks inside and goes, I don't know what I was expecting, because it was a dead dove. But it's used in fan fiction to basically say, read the tags because you get what you get. So like this could be used in like a kink thing where they're like, there's, I don't know, what's a weird kink, water sports in this, that like if you're not into that, don't read the fic because it's in it. It's essentially saying like read the tags because if you're not into it, that's on you at this point. I'm giving you warning that this exists inside of it, but it is also used for like non-consent / rape or other things that could be triggering to people. Like that sort of stuff is also tagged dead dove do not eat. If you are not in a place to read this, be aware that it's in it. But every once in a while it pops up on fandom that if you write fics that have dead dove do not eat, that you are like a morally reprehensible person. That like writing abuse or writing sexual assault means that like you somehow want that, which is not true. And a lot of people talk about how these fics in particular help them process their own trauma, help other people process their trauma. Like that's one of the things that literature does. It lets us engage with these hard topics in like a safe fashion because it's like taken off of our plates and put into these characters. So like this is a thing that like, do I feel like these books that have these elements shouldn't exist? No. But we oftentimes have the problem with is the romanticization within these books of that stuff.
Right.
Like that's where we have a problem. And then handing that, like usually dead dove fics are all rated E for explicit. On fanfiction sites it's tagged 18 plus. Like you need to be an adult to read these. There's other fics that get rated T for teen, like this is fine for anybody to read and anybody is welcome to read it. But when you have a physical book, books don't get rated like that. Like it's in the adult section, but anybody can buy those. Like and I'm sure as a librarian too, there's like some things that you can kind of curate. I'm sure kids have like specific boundaries within them, but like there's also this thing of like we don't want to censor things. So if as long as there's like knowledge and consent going into reading this book, like I'm not going to stop somebody from reading it.
Yeah, I mean, in a general way, kids will self-select.
Yes.
Like they will pick up a book and people are like, oh, we can't have that there because it will like frighten children. Like, listen, if they get a chapter in and they realize that it's scary, they're going to put it down. Like they're going to bring it back. Like they are not going to read something they don't want to read. I think the extra layer of that is like the peer pressure of like all of my friends have read this book. And therefore, if I want to be involved in the lunch table conversation, I have to read this book. And also, I mean, like, you know, again, I love Throne of Glass. I have a lot of thoughts about where Sarah J. Maas as a writer has gone from there. But I sold, I think 1 year, like nearly 100 copies of Throne of Glass, like hand selling at Barnes and Noble. And this was before, like that was when they were firmly YA. And then in later books, she added sex scenes. And I went, what do I do now? Like I was giving this book to, you know, younger teens, and I don't want someone's parent coming back to me now and being like, you gave my kids explicit sex. Like I didn't know.
Yeah.
You started somewhere and you ended somewhere else.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that. And so I do want to note that we recognize as a group that we have turned this from YA to adult authors to just like a general state of YA discussion.
Yeah. It's fine.
But there's just like so much to talk about here. Yeah. But I just want to like recognize what we've done.
Listen, we care a lot. we're in the industry, and it's important to all of us. So like it's something that we talk about constantly on the channel. I'm sure you have seen parts or things similar to this discussion over and over again on reviews and other discussions that we've done in general. So like in theory, people are here for that because that's what we do.
I mean, I think one of my more popular, like older videos is actually Where is the YA for Boys, which hasn't come up in this conversation. And I don't think we should bring it up because I think we've already been talking for around an hour, if not longer. But like that's a whole other thing too.
Still missing, by the way. Just an
update
missing. On that. Still missing.
And it's only like I felt like there was a brief moment when there was like some resurgence with like how popular. I mean, I know this wasn't YA necessarily, but like Rick Riordan was, and then Brandon Sanderson. Again, if you're talking about there was a huge move of adult fantasy authors into YA. That was the move prior to this. So like Brandon Sanderson is a really good example of someone who came in and was writing that kind of stuff.
Still is. I think Christopher
he's the newest one in that Christopher series. Paolini just made a comeback and published a new Aragon book, which I think he's decided is now firmly adult, but those were YA.
It at least is coded in the system at Barnes as YA still, Murtaugh. I did put the table in the adult sci-fi fantasy section only because I feel like Aragon is so... Yeah, exactly. The readers of Aragon have aged into the adult fantasy section. I don't know how many younger YA kids are still reading that series. It's shelved in there as well. But yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, I don't know if the target audience is YA anymore.
But yeah, I feel like there was like that moment briefly when it seemed like people were paying attention, it was going to change. But now with this whole like new romantasy thing, like again, I'm not saying that men cannot read romance. Like I'm not gatekeeping. I'm just saying if we talk general trends.
Yeah. 14-year-old boys tend not to care so much about the kissing parts. Not always, but sometimes. I know a lot of 14-year-old boys that don't want to read books where the protagonists are girls too, because they're still very much in their masculinity phase.
Well, and again, I mean, there was like Jason Reynolds had a really good conversation about this where like people were like, how dare you put a gun on the cover of one of your books? And one of the covers of his book is like a crocheted gun. And he was like, you got to make reading cool. Yeah. Like kids aren't gonna, especially boys, aren't gonna pick up books if like the cover is any flavor of like magenta, right? Like, again, not all boys, but trends.
Yes, yeah.
Interesting. There's so many questions in my head.
I know. I'm really worried that we'll just like continue going on for another hour.
Yeah. Probably
maybe we'll just have to do a sequel.
Listen, we'll go. I'm always down to do a discussion video and invite Anne in.
We'll just do this. We'll read a few more, right?
Yeah.
And then like I still have Book of Night on my shelves. We'll do this again, and then we'll just do it again.
Or we could do, let's try and read YA books for boys. Like, let's all try to find some YA books that are aimed at boys or that we think might be marketed at boys to read and see how we feel about those. Because they are few and far between, and I feel like that could be an interesting discussion as well.
It's been a while since I've read a YA for boys because they're just, you just don't see them that often.
Yeah. So, you know what? If you're here and you're watching and you've made it this far into the video, hi, you're our favorite. But also let us know, like, do you think that we should do another round of this? Do you think that we should do YA books for boys? Is there something else that you think that we should tackle? All three? Because we have the power to make multiple videos, as you may know. And so if you're interested in any of these topics and bringing back Anne, and maybe even some of our other friends for, let us know if you'd be interested in those videos, and we'll definitely prioritize getting those done.
Sounds awesome.
So again, we would just like to thank Anne for being here this evening and offering to come back and spend time with us to do another 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 videos. Again, when Michaela and I knew that we wanted to do this video, we just said Anne has to come. Anne was our desired guest for this because I mean, Anne's awesome, duh. But also Anne is also reading a lot more YA recently than we are. So thank you to Anne for joining us. Thank you for watching. And obviously our plans have plans. So we'll see you again with another one of these.
Yeah, I think this is our last video for the year for 2023.
Oh my gosh, that's right. Yeah. So hopefully, this is this is a great way for us to have gone out, getting back not only to talking about books, but more discussion videos, which I don't think we've really done in a while.
Not a lot this year, yeah.
And are always some of our favorite things to do. So thank you for the journey. The introduction of the Reading Roundtable came in 2023. And so we look forward to a full slate of those in 2024 as well. So thanks for a great year, and we'll see you in the new one. Bye.